What's their name?
She's called Molly,
Molly. Okay.
but she's really excited, so I'm just going to try for her. Let's just put it out there that injuries always happen on the last rep of a set. It's also all for steroids as well, so you've got to kind of take that into account.
Yes.
My first protocol will always be with somebody. If we're not seeing progress, it's
What is up, my bodyweight warriors, and welcome back to another video. Today's video is the full-length conversation that I had with Tom Merrick, the bodyweight warrior, about training to failure and a bunch of other calisthenics related things. There are timestamps all down here if you want to skip around this video, but I highly suggest you watch it all the way through if you want maximum gains and maximum progress. Maybe even watch it twice, all right? Definitely go check out all the other videos in this series all over here or over there, I don't really know. And if you want us to talk a little bit quicker through this video, there is a little settings button right down here where you could change the playback speed of this video and we will talk a little bit quicker. But with all that out of the way, let's get over to Tom. If you just want to give a little brief introduction for anyone out of the few people that may not know you.
Sure thing. So I'm Tom, aka the Bodyweight Warrior. I make videos here on YouTube as well, primarily to do with bodyweight training and then the associated sort of flexibility, handstands, and all of that sort of fun stuff. Myself have been doing bodyweight training in some form or another for probably the best part of a decade. I think it's like 7 or 8 years now, just rounding it up. I feel like through my trials and tribulations, as we all experience, I've kind of gone down one avenue or another, and certainly given most things that I can a go. And I like to pass on that experience, certainly not as a guru, certainly not as somebody who knows everything, but hopefully to help people out.
Awesome. Cool. So the big question, someone walks up to you in the gym and asks, Tom, should I be training to failure or should I not be? What's the answer?
I think my first answer would be a question, and it would be like, how long have you been training? There's several questions to go off that, but really I feel like how long you can be training is probably the big one. If you're a beginner, really no need to go to failure. Just by doing some sort of physical activity, by applying that stimulus, you're going to get pretty good progress. You don't need to push yourself to that point. If you've been training a little bit longer, if your training ages are higher, then certainly to keep making progress, we need to keep testing our body in different ways, and failure can be a useful tool. We spoke briefly about the comparison between sort of Jeff Nippard's take on this, and certainly a big fan of him. And obviously that's down to more of a bodybuilding, weightlifting focus. And there does need to be a difference made between bodyweight training and weight training, because certainly bodyweight training is going to be less intensive. Although it is hard, it's still intense. I think just from a tax perspective on the central nervous system, it's not going to be the same. Certainly when we're training compound movements like pull-ups, handstand push-ups, push-ups, like if we push to failure, maybe we can't do a movement, but it's not quite to the same degree as like if we're going to muscular failure on an isolation exercise. It's very different. There's usually going to be some more technical aspect that's going to limit our ability to perform an exercise before we reach that muscular failure. So yeah, if you're a beginner, don't worry about failure. Just train hard, push yourself a little bit. If you're more advanced, feel free to add it in, but I wouldn't be doing it every single set, every single exercise.
Awesome. I think that's a great response. Do you use failure training in your own training cycles? And what are your thoughts on you personally? And as well, what is your familiarity, or do you use RPE or RAR at all?
So I do push to close to failure, but again, like I'll push more to failure on more isolation exercises. So with compound movements, or if I'm training handstand push-up, one arm chin up, I'll probably be close to technical failure. Which so we've got technical failure, absolute failure. Technical failure is when you start to see a breakdown of form, and start to see not necessarily compensation, but that's when you start getting to the point where you're grinding things out a little bit, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm happy to sit around that for most of my training, but usually I will have a bit of a crescendo with sets, so that will sort of appear in maybe the third, fourth, fifth set of an exercise. And then maybe if I'm finishing up with some tricep work, some bicep work, that's when, or even some chest flies or something else, that's when I might take something more towards muscular failure, for that hypertrophy reason, because at the end of the day, we would like to look good as well as be able to perform things well.
Yeah. Awesome. So I definitely agree with you mostly on everything you're saying, but as I've been hearing more people talk about it and dive more into it, it's definitely making me question my own thoughts. And I was always a big proponent of kind of tracking RPE and kind of fluctuating that over a training cycle. And I don't know if that's the best thing anymore, honestly. And especially after talking to Sonder, I don't know if I mentioned, I talked to him a few weeks ago, and he is all for training to failure. Everything beyond absolute failure. I mean, he's like all out, and I feel like that's something that's common with people that are kind of on the cusp of the most elite or really high up there. I think Jeff in his interviews interviewed Stephanie Cohen, which is one of like the strongest women powerlifters out there, and she was as well all for that training to failure. And I think my kind of question when I see that is, are those the people that are getting away with training to failure? Are those the exception to the rule? Or is that the way that you need to be training to get to that elite level? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, Stephanie Cohen's also all for steroids as well, so you've got to kind of take that into account.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. But I think, yeah, no, that's a good point.
Okay, so yeah, probably more so in the bodyweight space, in the bodybuilding space than the bodyweight space. You got to consider, like, are you enhanced or not? Yeah. If you're enhanced, you can deal with a lot more than I think. I don't actually think training to failure is inherently bad. It's more like, how frequently are you training to failure? That's probably going to be the biggest kicker. Certainly if you're a normal bodyweight athlete who's doing maybe an upper lower split, training upper body twice a week, or you're doing push pull legs, realistically with that training volume, you can get away with training to failure. I just wouldn't do it on every set. It's not so much the taxing aspect of it. It's more just like how much it'll impact your session.
Yeah.
Just think, if you go balls to wall on your first set of every single exercise, your first exercise might be okay, and then everything after that's just gonna suck. Right? If you're actually going to failure.
Yeah.
So realistically, I don't know if it's required to get to that level, but certainly you need to push yourself. So whether that's failure or not, I always like Charles Poliquin's take on RPE. He's like, he wasn't a big fan. He was like, if we're doing a set of 5, the set of 5 is hard. Like if we're doing a set of 3, the set of 3 is hard. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. It should be challenging.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing. I think RPE is a good way of scaling that. But I would just say, like, if you're training, everything should be hard, really, unless explicitly the intent is to make it easier. But certainly, I think a lot in the powerlifting community, which is where kind of a lot of the RPE stuff and the fatigue management comes from, is they're often training 3 big compound movements in one day. They're doing squat, bench, deadlift in one day. It's like, yeah, you probably do need to manage how much you're exerting yourself when you're doing that sort of amount of lifting and tonnage and stuff. Whereas bodyweight training, like, it's a different kettle of fish, really.
Yeah. Okay. I hear what you're saying on that. You did mention there might be some trade-off in fatigue management for going shy of failure, and that's one of the reasons that the proponents of going shy of failure kind of use that. But there's also that increased likelihood of injury with going to failure, and I know you've had plenty of injuries, so have I. So do you find that when you go closer to failure, you're personally increasing that risk? Is that something that is a concern when you're training people? Those people that always get injured, things like that.
It's hard to say. So I guess let's just put it out there that injuries always happen on the last rep of a set, but it's the same reason as, like, when you're looking for something, it's always in the last place you look. It's because you won't continue a set after you've injured, right? So you could say whether it's failure or it's not. I think injuries are quite multifactorial. Fatigue definitely plays a part in injuries. It's like, if you're pushing consistently for maybe 10, 12 weeks, no deload, no time off, and you're going to failure a lot, are you going to increase your risk of injury? Like I would have thought you're probably feeding a lot of the factors that would influence that. Are you using failure appropriately? Is it more of an isolation exercise? Because obviously there's a big difference. You can go into failure with compound versus isolation. Yeah, there's quite a few factors to consider. I wouldn't say that going to failure does put you at risk of injury more so than just training. But I just guess common sense would kind of dictate that it would expose yourself to situations that may cause injury more regularly. So, I think it's like an overall kind of factor to it in terms of not so much that set going to failure. It's like everything else going into it. If you're generally fatigued and lifestyle stress and not sleeping well, you eating enough, there's so many other factors other than just like, is that set to failure?
Okay. Yeah. I think especially from the bodybuilding side, people are always saying, well, body weight is easy. You can take it to failure every day. Someone like Alpha Destiny on YouTube, calisthenics, is pretty easy. You could be doing sets of pull-ups to failure every day for the week. And I think that's something that a lot of beginners latch onto, or, that really want to get the grind, want to make their progress as fast as possible. And they're saying, I'll just do failure pull-ups every day. And why am I not making progress? Or why am I getting injured? And I think that's something that people kind of overlook in the information that they find on YouTube or from bodybuilding people. Any 2 cents on, you kind of covered it for beginners. Should they be training to failure? Is it useful at all?
I think ultimately it just comes down to the fact that fatigue will mask fitness. So if you're constantly tired, constantly worn out, you're never going to be able to perform at your best. Doing more isn't better. Going to failure on every set isn't failure. Isn't better. Sorry. I always would work on minimum effective dose. It's like, what do we need to make the best progress possible? And then there's usually a spectrum. You have minimum effective dose and you have maximal tolerable volume. It's like, you're going to fall within that bounds. If you're going to failure all the time, you're probably going to be pushing that top end. And to be honest with you don't tend to make better progress. If we're looking at this in terms of like, are we making progress? Maybe if we're not pushing ourselves to failure, are we making progress? My first protocol will always be with somebody, if we're not seeing progress, is to take stuff away. It's always do less, test that, do that for 6 to 8 weeks. How has the progress been? Has it got better? Yes. Okay, we're doing too much beforehand. Continue on this path. Has it got any better? No. Okay, let's try and do more volume and see how that goes. So more isn't better. And certainly as a beginner, and it comes down a bit to like, how do you want to train? Like if you enjoy training to failure and pushing yourself to that degree, it's like, yeah, cool, do that. But just, be aware that maybe you want to do that not as frequently, or if you are going to do that, just do a little bit less sets. Do you need to do 5 sets if you're taking every single set to failure? Would you get the same response from doing 3 sets to failure? It's like, yeah, test it out, give it a try. Ultimately, like, progress is the biggest thing. If you're making progress, you're probably doing something right. If you're not making progress, then you need to go back to the drawing board.
I totally agree with everything you just said there. I hit a wall in my front lever training maybe a year or so ago where I was not making any progress and I was just adding more and more and more onto, and it does not work. I ended up getting injured. It's kind of that mentality of, well, if I just try harder, then maybe that's what I'm missing. And it wasn't until I pulled my training way back to where I thought, all right, I don't even know if this is going to be helpful at all for my training, and slowly added on over like 6 months, very, very slow progress until I kind of got close to that wall of where it's really difficult. That's when I was seeing the most progress.
Yeah. You're not alone, certainly in that. Yeah. I would say probably the last 2 or 3 years is where I've seen the best progress in my training. It's probably the period of time I've done the least amount of actual training.
Yeah.
It's all about what you can recover from.
Right.
And yes, body weight training isn't as intense as weight training. Certainly, it just isn't. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to do more than it. If you want to make good progress, yeah. Train smart and train hard.
I think that's a pretty good suggestion. And one last training question about handstand training. How do you kind of manage your fatigue as well as training to failure, or are you thinking about training to failure at all with more skill-based training?
Handstands is kind of an interesting one because there's an aspect in handstands about learning to fight, and and certainly like it depends. If you're just learning to handstand for the first time, like then yeah, you don't want to be going to failure really. Like we're looking at quality of movement, and you know we want to be able to get as much time as possible balancing. If we go to failure for a few sets, we're just going to be fried, and we're not going to be able to do the rest of it with quality. It's like, hey, the focus is on the skill work. Generally should be done a little bit lower in terms of the percentage of like, you know, that maximum exertion. But after we can like do a skill, after we have some proficiency in it, which is the difference again between like, are you a beginner or are you advanced? Once you have proficiency, you can start taking things to failure, because that's when you're going to start to see some better gains in your practice. You need to, especially with handstands, you need to learn how to fight. You need to learn how to push. You need to learn how to do things when you are a bit tired and you are a bit fatigued, because ultimately you're going to come across those situations in, you know, if you're doing shape coordinations, or if you're doing your press to handstand, if you're trying to learn one arm, you need to just deal with the aspects in which you're exposed to when you are fatigued. So for the most part, no, I tend to try and keep fresh with my handstands, but yeah, like there'll be sets where you have to grind it out and figure that out.
Yeah, and I think that comes with kind of years of training or training intelligence, knowing when you can push and how much that's going to fatigue you, and whether you can keep that up throughout the week, or whether it's going to screw you over for 2 weeks.
I mean, you'll soon find out if you're doing too much, because things will either stay the same or go downhill.
Yeah, totally. I've been there, and I know how that feels. Anything else you wanted to add on to this topic, or any discussion?
No, I think I would just say like two things really. Understand that you have seasons in training, so there's periods of time to push yourself, and there's periods of time to take a break and take it easy. I would generally have my clients take a week off every 12 weeks. You know, nothing wrong with taking a week off, 2 weeks off here and there. Professional athletes pretty much religiously will take 2 to 3, maybe a month off on their off season after they finish their season of training. It's definitely a smart thing to do as an amateur. Somebody who doesn't do that as a job tries to go balls to all year round, it's just not going to end well. Give yourself a break every now and again. And then equally on the flip side, don't be too afraid of fatigue that you don't ever push yourself to a point in which, you know, you're actually going to see progress. Like training should be hard. It should be hard. But it doesn't need to be absolutely cripplingly hard. It needs to be hard, and then you also need to then go away and recover.
Yeah. And I think it's not good to fall into the trap of I should only be training hard, or I should only be training submaximally. I think that's something that that people kind of fall into, especially personally after you get injured. You're like, okay, well, maybe I should just stay away from training to failure. And I kind of stuck with that. It worked for a little while, but as we're training, we should not be expecting the same training to be working the same way throughout our career. It should, we need that introspection to say, okay, now I'm a step ahead of where I was before, and I do need to push to make progress, or I do need to pull back for a week or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like you have periods of training where you really push yourself, and periods of training where you take it a bit easier and you do more general work. It's just good periodization at the end of the day.
Awesome.
And ultimately as well, like if you're recovering from an injury, the ultimate recovery of injury is to be able to do the thing that got you injured again, which is a hard thing to mentally do, but that's like the end goal.
Yeah, because you're going to want to pull back. You know, it hurt you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Obviously done with caution, and you want to build yourself up to it. You don't want to just like, oh, I feel better, let's go and do the thing that injured me in the first place. But you know what I mean? Like that's the sign that you're truly recovered.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of which, how's the hamstring? How's the shoulder?
Yeah, I was about to say so I had an adductor tear on doing chair splits. Right. So I will do chair splits again. At the moment, I'm doing lots of sets of middle split isometric sort of holds at, again, submaximal depth, but longer durations, trying to build up again. But it might like for the injuries that I have had, it feels good. No issues with the adductors, squatting heavy again, pushing leg training again. And my infraspinatus tear that I had, I didn't rehab properly the first time, and then is feeling good now. So again, I'm just easing back into it. Yeah. But actually, I realized that these two injuries came down, I think, in part just to not eating enough. I've been pretty busy, and I just haven't been too focused on how much I've been eating. I've been eating good stuff, but I think I tracked some calories the other day, and I was like, oh, I actually only ate like 2,400 calories today. Like it's nowhere near enough for somebody who's, I don't know, 200 pounds, 6'4".
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I'm a big person, not necessarily big muscular wise. I'm just like a big human.
Yeah.
You need some calories to sustain that. So yeah,
Definitely.
it's all the other factors that go into it. It's not just the training to failure.
Right. I'm a little bit shorter than you, but I'm still not. I'm 6 foot, about 175.
Hey, you're still a big guy.
Yeah, yeah, and I've got a front lever, so I mean, I'm not.
That's strong. That's strong.
Not bad, not bad. I'm not doing archer front lever pull-ups or one arm muscle ups or anything like that. But
I don't think I'll ever be doing that. So
you never know. You never know. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really, truly appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Yeah.